place is mine! I'm here every day at this time.
There's no name on it.
There doesn't need to be a name on it to be mine.
She had no idea that the man she was about to snap at in a parking lot owned the building his dying mother lived in, and that in 19 days, the same math that was about to cost her own apartment would decide whether he ever found out who she really was. She didn't know any of that yet. At 7:52 that morning, all she knew was that there was one parking spot left, and someone else's car was already easing into it. Claire Bennett got to the lot with 6 minutes to spare, the way she got there every weekday. No room in the schedule for anything to go wrong. She pulled up alongside the black car, rolled her window down, and said the thing before she'd fully decided to say it. "That one's mine. I'm here every day at this time. You can't just take it." The man in the black car rolled his window down too. 35, maybe younger. Handsome in the kind of understated way that took a second to register, because nothing about him was trying to announce it. "There's no name on it," he said. "Not unkind. Just a fact. There doesn't need to be. There's a routine on it. 2 years of routine. Ask anyone in that building." He looked at the building. Then at her, the scrubs under her open coat, the travel mug wedged between the seats, the clock reading 7:53, 7 minutes before a shift that didn't wait for stragglers. He backed out. She didn't thank him. She didn't have 7 minutes to spend on gratitude. She pulled in, grabbed her bag and jogged into the building, the exchange already filed away and forgotten. The way you forget the 100th ordinary friction of an ordinary week. It would not stay forgotten. But she didn't know that yet. Claire was 36, a home health aide for 11 years, the last 4 spent almost entirely inside one building, a mid-rise called the Aldermont, in a mid-sized Ohio city, 4 blocks from the hospital that had first assigned her there. She had a son, Micah, 9 years old, sharp in the way kids get when they've had to grow up faster than the adults around them planned for. Her entire schedule was built around one fact. She needed to be home by 3:40 every school day, because there was no one else who would be. His father had been gone 2 years, not dramatically, just gone to Tucson with a check that came 4 times in 2 years and a text that always mentioned things being tight right now, as if tight were a season instead of where he'd moved permanently. There was a rent notice on her kitchen counter she hadn't opened, because she already knew what it said. Her building had changed hands 4 months earlier. The new owners had raised the rent $640 a month, effective in 19 days. She'd run the math 9 times. 9 times she came up roughly $400 short every month, for as far forward as she could see. She had told no one at work. Pity, she'd learned, never paid a bill. 2 floors above where Claire would spend her morning, in an apartment she'd lived in for 6 years and refused to leave, a 71-year-old woman named Eleanor sat by the window with an oxygen line looped over her ears, waiting for the aide who was always, without exception, on time. She had made her son promise years ago, never to tell anyone in this building who he really was. He'd kept that promise so completely that Claire, who knew the names of both of Eleanor's grandchildren and exactly how she liked her pillow angled, had no idea the man who occasionally visited owned not just this building, but a great many like it. He was, at that moment, 2 streets over, walking the last 2 blocks on foot, still thinking about a woman in scrubs who had told him, flatly, that he was wrong. He had not been offended. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Neither of them knew yet what the other was about to mean to this story. In 19 days, her rent would come due. In about 19 minutes, they were going to meet again. Nathan Cole rode the elevator to the 6th floor carrying 2 things. A coffee he'd bought 2 streets over to make up for the 19 minutes he was now running late, and the small, specific guilt he always carried into these visits, the guilt of a son who owned 40-some buildings and had never quite figured out how to be present in the one where his mother actually lived. The door was already unlocked. It always was on days Claire worked. Desmond, his mother said. She still used his middle name sometimes, an old habit from childhood she'd never fully dropped. "You've met Claire." "We've met," Claire said, not looking up from the blood pressure cuff, a faint and entirely professional flatness in her voice that gave nothing away. If she recognized him from the lot, she didn't show it. Her job had trained that reflex out of her years ago. Don't make the visit about yourself. Not even for a second. Not even when the son of your patient is also the stranger who backed out of a parking spot for you 2 hours earlier. He sat across the room and watched her work. She checked his mother's oxygen levels before being asked. She noticed the blanket slipping mid-sentence and fixed it without breaking her conversation. She crouched to Eleanor's eye level instead of standing over her. A small thing most people never think to do. She's the only one who talks to me like I'm still a person, Eleanor told him later, once Claire had stepped into the kitchen to log the morning's vitals. Not a set of numbers on a chart. He asked carefully, the way you ask a question you're not sure you're allowed to ask. How long Claire had been doing this work? 11 years, his mother said. Boy at home. No husband in the picture. 2 buses most mornings because her car had transmission trouble she couldn't yet afford to fix, which was, his mother added, why she'd been especially glad the parking situation worked out that morning, though she didn't explain why it had needed working out. Nathan didn't ask. He didn't need to. He was already doing the math himself the way he did math on everything, instinctively, and usually too late to stop himself from caring about the answer. He left that afternoon without saying anything to Claire about the lot. But he went home, and for the first time in longer than he could account for, he opened a property file himself instead of forwarding it to the team that managed it. The Aldermont. 3 sublayers deep, exactly where routine acquisitions get buried so they can be forgotten the moment they close. He was not planning to forget this one. Claire didn't think about the man in 6B again until 3 days later, when Micah asked her, over dinner, whether they were moving. He asked it the way 9-year-olds ask things they've clearly been sitting with for a while. Casually, eyes on his plate, bracing for the answer before it came. I don't know yet, she said, which was the truth, and worse than a lie, because at least a lie would have given him something to hold. She had seen 11 apartments in 3 weeks. All of them farther from the hospital. All of them meaning a bus transfer she didn't currently need. All of them meaning Micah alone for an extra 40 minutes after school. A number that sounds small until you're the parent who has spent 4 years building a schedule specifically to avoid it. She sat at the kitchen table after he went to bed and opened the Notes app on her phone, the one where she kept the running math, updated so many times the earliest entries didn't match the later ones anymore. $640. 400 short every month. 16 days now, not 19. She thought about calling her mother 3 states away and decided against it. Not because her mother wouldn't help, but because her mother would ask questions Claire didn't have the energy to answer gently. She thought briefly and without meaning to about the man in the black car. Not because she expected anything from him. She didn't even know his name yet. It was just that he was the only stranger who'd backed down from something that week without making her fight for it. And some days that was enough to make a person linger in your head a little longer than they deserved to. She closed the Notes app. 16 days. She went back to work the next morning at 7:52, same as always, and found the lot half empty and her usual spot open, and thought nothing more of it. The number, when Nathan finally traced it all the way through, was smaller than he expected and worse than he wanted it to be. The $640 increase at the Aldermont wasn't a mistake. It was a policy, applied uniformly across the building, set by a regional manager optimizing for a return target Nathan himself had approved 8 months earlier. 1 bullet point among 40 on a call he'd taken while walking between meetings, back when the number had been an abstraction with no face attached to it. Had a face now. He didn't know Claire's rent was tied to a different building entirely. He assumed reasonably that she lived where she worked, and it took him 2 more days and 1 uncomfortable conversation with his assistant to learn otherwise. What he found instead was simpler and in its own way harder to sit with. 11 blocks over, in a triplex he had no ownership stake in at all, a woman who cared for his dying mother 6 mornings a week was 19. Now 14. Days from being unable to afford to live near either of them. Over a gap of $400 a month that his own company would not have blinked at covering 1,000 times over without noticing. He could not fix her actual rent. It wasn't his building. That fact sat with him longer than he expected it to. The particular helplessness of having enormous reach and discovering, for the first time in years, a problem sitting just outside it. But the Aldermont was his. And whatever he couldn't do for Claire directly, he could still do for the version of Claire that might one day be sitting in some other building, on some other floor, doing this exact math with a 9-year-old asleep down the hall. He thought about her crouching to his mother's eye level. He thought about the parking spot, and the fact that she'd been right and hadn't needed him to admit it to know it. 3 days later, he sent one instruction to the regional manager overseeing the Aldermont: cap any future increase at 4% for tenants of 18 months or longer, effective immediately. No explanation beyond a note about recalculated comparables. It wouldn't touch Claire's rent. He knew that going in. He sent it anyway because fixing the one thing he could reach felt, that week, like the only honest answer to a problem he otherwise had no right to solve for her. Claire found out who Nathan really was on a Tuesday, in the plainest way possible. "He's been asking a lot of questions," Eleanor said between sips of tea, "about the woman who yelled at him in the parking lot." She laughed, the specific laugh of someone who knows more than she's saying and is enjoying every second of not saying it yet. Claire's hands went still on the blood pressure cuff. "That was your son." "That was my son." Eleanor took another sip, unhurried, watching Claire's face do the math in real time. "He owns this building, dear. He owns quite a lot of buildings, actually. I made him promise years ago never to mention it to anyone here. I did not want to be looked at differently. And you never once looked at me differently. Not in 4 months. Which is more than I can say for people who've known me 30 years. Claire sat back on her heels, running through every visit, replaying the parking lot with a completely different man standing in it than the one she remembered. The plain jacket, the unhurried backing out, the fact that he'd looked at her like her 7 minutes actually mattered. "I told him he couldn't have that spot," she said slowly. "You were right," Eleanor said. "He talked about you longer than he talks about almost anyone. That's rare for him." Nothing dramatic followed. No envelope. No grand gesture. Nathan had decided, the same way his mother had decided about her apartment years earlier, that quietly fixing the system a person stood inside was worth more than fixing one person's problem by hand and calling it generosity. But 4 months later, when the agency that employed Claire lost its hospital contract in a routine reorganization, the kind of thing that happens to home health workers constantly, without warning, she got a call from a company she'd never heard of. A private staffing firm managing care for a small roster of families, offering a rate 40% higher than the agency had ever paid, with a schedule built explicitly around a 9-year-old's school hours, because the intake coordinator had asked what hours worked and built the job around the answer instead of the other way around. She took it. It would be another year before she learned, almost by accident, whose company it actually was. By then, it didn't especially matter. The math finally worked. Claire kept the old rent notice in a drawer, the one that never actually forced her out, because the new job came through before the deadline did. She still doesn't know for certain how close the two things were connected. She has her suspicions. She's never asked, the same way Eleanor preferred being Adiz from 6B to being the mother of a name people recognized. Here's the part of the story that isn't really about a parking spot at all. Most of us assume the people with power got there by noticing big things, markets, timing, the right move at the right moment. But the people who actually deserve to keep that power are usually paying attention to something much smaller. Whether the person crouching down to talk to a dying woman at eye level is doing it because someone's watching, or because that's simply who she is when no one important is in the room. And most of us, the ones without a company or a building or a name that opens doors, assume our only leverage is politeness. That if we just stay quiet, stay agreeable, don't make a scene over a parking spot or a policy or a decision that reshapes our whole life, someone above us will eventually notice our patience and reward it. They usually don't. The world rarely rewards the people who stayed quiet. It notices the ones who were simply, unapologetically right, and didn't apologize for saying so. You don't know who's in the car next to you. You don't know who's listening in the next room. You very likely never will. The only thing you actually control is whether the version of you that shows up when you think no one important is watching is a version you'd be willing to stand behind if it turned out someone was.